Rome, the bustling capital of modern Italy, and in ancient times the center of one of the greatest civilizations ever. A civilization whose achievements in Europe could be rivaled only by the Greeks. Together, these two great lost civilizations would provide the inspiration for the Renaissance in art of the 16th century. The term Renaissance means literally rebirth, and for the artists and thinkers of the 1500s, a rebirth was what they consciously sought. A rebirth of the skills of the Greek and Roman artists that had been lost during the previous 1,000 years. Appropriately, this idea of rebirth began to make itself felt here in Italy early in the 15th century. But it was felt most strongly not here in Rome, but 150 miles to the north, in the Tuscan city of Florence. An attractive, prosperous city today, Florence is famed the world over for its art galleries. In an independent, outward-looking city made wealthy by trade and commerce, a new fascination with the apparently lost times of the ancients began to develop. But in addition to rediscovering ancient skills, the Florentine artists of the early Renaissance also made their own discoveries. Painters, such as Masaccio, were the first in history to demonstrate the representation of three-dimensional space on a two-dimensional surface, an utterly significant leap forward in art technique. It was into this culture that a teenage boy arrived in the mid-1460s, his family having moved from the nearby Tuscan village where he was born. A precociously talented youth, he would take advantage of the opportunities for learning afforded by Florence and develop into one of the greatest human beings who has ever lived, and a giant of Renaissance art, Leonardo da Vinci. From an early age, Leonardo demonstrated an insatiable appetite for study, and the sheer breadth of his research can be seen in his surviving notebooks. But Leonardo was first and foremost an artist who soaked up the technical advances in art taking place in his lifetime. By his 30s, he was already well known, both in Florence and beyond. His unfinished Adoration of the Magi, on display in the city's great Uffizi Gallery, displays his early mastery of the new science of perspective and his dramatically solid, authentically posed figures, all arranged in the satisfying pyramid design which had been pioneered by Botticelli in his Adoration of the Magi, also in the Uffizi. Leonardo's Adoration would remain unfinished, however, since 1482 would see the young genius leave Florence to enter the service of the Duke of Milan, where he would remain for 18 years, working as the Duke's chief engineer and architect amongst other duties, while at the same time continuing his research, notably his study of the human body. But Leonardo's years in Milan also saw him continuing to paint, and between 1495 and 1498, on the wall of a dining hall in the Milanese monastery of Santa Maria delle Grazie, he created one of the great works of Western art, The Last Supper.
Leonardo da Vinci, when he was in Milan, painted The Last Supper. He extends the room very clearly, linking it to the actual structure of the refectory. He pushes the space back, but bends the laws in the sense that we're looking down up at Christ. We see a magnificent view of the table. We shouldn't actually be seeing this. So he's using two formats. He's bending the laws of perspective. He groups the figures around the table in 4 units of 3s. These figures are all interlinked through gesture.
The moment chosen is when Christ says, "One of you shall betray me." And the reactions will range from kind of absolute horror to questioning. And it's a very cleverly devised picture. The whole thing is kind of anchored So everything is focused on Christ's head. The apostles look towards him, and it reinforces the perspective. Judas, in previous paintings, had sometimes been isolated from the rest of the apostles. He appears in the group to the right of Christ, but he leans on the table. He's isolated in that way, and he looks up. He's more bearded, he's kind of frowning. That is Leonardo's kind of skill in actually portraying human emotion in a range of physical types, young men to old men, with realism perhaps which hadn't been kind of achieved before. And it is a quite remarkable achievement.
Soon after the completion of the Last Supper, Leonardo was forced to leave Milan when it fell to the armies of the French, and he returned to Florence in 1500. By 1502, he had found himself a new patron, Cesare Borgia, the Duke of Romagna and illegitimate son of Pope Alexander VI. Working principally as the Duke's architect and engineer, Leonardo also executed several portraits, although only one of them has survived to the present day. This single surviving work, however, can claim to be the most famous portrait in the world. Now on display in the Louvre, Paris, it is Leonardo's eternal image of a Florentine woman of his time, the Mona Lisa.
This is perhaps the most famous work of Western art. It is a portrait, though, and what Leonardo has achieved, which is so different from earlier portraits, is that there's a mystery to it, and this, I think, has focused attention on it from the 16th century onwards. It is a lady portrayed three-quarter view in a rather distant kind of landscape. What makes Leonardo's kind of achievements so significant, though, is that he moves away, for example, from the profile portrait of the 15th century and presents somebody tilted towards us, displacing space. And what Leonardo, I think, quite rightly kind of learned is that you could achieve more mystery sometimes not by trying to define, but by suggesting. So this kind of veiled smoke-like quality known as sfumato both adds to the kind of mystery because Leonardo hints rather than defines. We are looking at it, of course, in a kind of uncleaned state, and no doubt perhaps the colours would have been much, much brighter in Leonardo's time. But it is a portrait which has kind of mystery. There's a beauty to her, and it draws the crowds every day.
By the time of the creation of the Mona Lisa, Leonardo was already a legend, whose skills were sought by the great men of his age. During his days under Cesare Borgia in Florence, for instance, he was asked to join a committee of artists to decide where to place a new statue created by a 28-year-old Florentine contemporary. But this small task for Leonardo was more significant than it would first appear, and it gives us an idea of the fertility of Florentine art of the time, for the statue concerned would become one of the most famous sculptures ever, and its creator would achieve near divine status in his own lifetime: Michelangelo. Born in 1475, Michelangelo is considered to be the second of the great Florentine artists of what is usually referred to as the High Renaissance. Traveling to Rome at the age of 20, he was able to study many classical statues at first hand, and the young Michelangelo took on board as many lessons from the past as he could. His Pietà, a subtle, restrained piece in St. Peter's Basilica, Rome, established his fame. By 1504, he had completed the sculpture whose location would be decided by Leonardo and others. A marble statue, over 14 feet high, Michelangelo's David was originally placed on the Piazza della Signoria in front of Florence's town hall. A copy now stands there, the original being now in the Galleria dell'Accademia. Encountering the David remains a truly unforgettable experience.
This is a phenomenal piece of sculpture. In terms of Michelangelo's achievements as a sculptor, I mean, he created this out of an abandoned block of marble, 18 feet tall. It shows the defiant David, weight on the right leg, anticipating the advancing kind of Goliath. It is really a kind of a picture of heroism, and almost serves as a kind of icon for the aspirations of the city of Florence itself.
It's a monumental sculpture which has a proportioned form which relates to antiquity. Within this form you have, as it were, stylization, especially when you see the hands, almost to the extending them beyond a naturalistic quality. The face itself is more Romanesque, so it's almost a combination of stylization. It's very much almost a three-quarter relief sculpture because of the actual block it came from. One almost can't really view it in the round. One tends to view it from the front. And that monumentality of the young, taut muscles is clearly perceived within the image.
It is perhaps the most heroic figure of the male nude that exists in Western European art. But this is a youthful figure, but it also has something, the scale of a giant.
The Palace of the Vatican, Rome. An enormous complex of buildings at the heart of the authority of the Church of Rome, and home to a priceless collection of books, manuscripts, and artworks from throughout history, and a chapel constructed during the late 15th century pontificate of Pope Sixtus IV, a noted patron of the arts. This Sistine Chapel was to be the location for one of the most extraordinary feats in Western art history. By the early 16th century, its walls had been painted by artists as eminent as the great Botticelli, but the ceiling remained blank. It was the new Pope, Julius II, who proposed that this ceiling should be illustrated by Michelangelo. And how? In 4 years of solitary work between 1508 and 1512, lying on scaffolding flat on his back, Michelangelo used the technique of frescoing, applying paint to wet plaster, to produce his masterpiece.
The Sistine Chapel depicts the creation of the earth and then creation of the man, the expulsion, and then, as it were, the destruction of man and its salvation all the way across in separate frescoes. Michelangelo alternates the design. He has large, small frescoes that punch all the way back.
Centrally placed, of course, is the creation of Adam. And this shows one of the most heroic figures, man about to be created by God, who leans towards him. And a spark of energy is about to be transmitted to the Adam who lies on a sketchily outlined kind of landscape, a heroic reclining kind of figure. And no doubt Michelangelo's kind of inspiration in terms of where the form came from perhaps was his study of Hellenistic sculpture, massive muscular forms. They're not in a sense kind of portraits. These are ideal types.
The innumerable little male figures that interact with the frames possibly could be considered humanist sort of angels, but are more likely his desire to explore the male nude to its fullest extent. And Vasari quite rightly says, his knowledge of the nude in action, its distortion, is phenomenal and hadn't been seen before. There were problems, of course, with the nudes in the sense that this is a chapel, a church, and to have naked men lounging around was not considered politic later on, and they sent another painter up who carefully positioned drapes to sort of cover up the male genitalia.
In 1509, Pope Julius commissioned another series of frescoes for a suite of rooms within the Vatican. To carry out the work, he chose a 26-year-old then resident in the artistic melting pot that was Florence. Indeed, although this artist hailed from the town of Umbino, he is now regarded as the third great artist of the Florentine High Renaissance, Raffaello Santi, or Raphael. Raphael's greatest achievement within the Vatican can be seen within a room known as the Stanza della Segnatura. The frescoes on the four walls illustrate the division of human knowledge as it was then understood, with allegorical figures representing theology, poetry, philosophy, and justice set in the ceiling, with frescoes beneath to illustrate each concept. Frescoes such as this, and others such as the nymph Galatea, which can still be seen in Rome's Villa Farnesina, would have been enough to secure him his fame within his lifetime. But it is not for these that Raphael is best known, but from a series of paintings executed during his earlier period in Florence. Having arrived there at the age of 21 into an environment dominated by Leonardo and Michelangelo, he quickly produced a series of images of the Virgin Mary that have come to be seen as almost an industry standard for such devotional work. And a superb example of Raphael's Madonnas can be seen in the Uffizi in Florence, entitled The Madonna of the Goldfinch.
One can easily look at Raphael's Madonna with the goldfinch and see Leonardo da Vinci's pyramidical composition. Within this particular image, Raphael softens, and there's more naturalistic harmony between the two young figures of St. John and Christ. The stories, of course, relates, and the bird relates to the passion of Christ, his death eventually. Within this, of course, you've got the softness of colour through the chiaroscuro, which bounces throughout the entire scene. The only harsh element in the background are the trees, which lead the eye into the surrounding, almost naturalistic setting. The curve of the figures is less angular, I suppose, than Leonardo. It has more physicality to it. And definitely the use of chiaroscuro across the entire image, and the softening of colours and the blending are clearly perceived. But within the composition itself, it is this pyramidical format which he uses many times over that period.
Although Raphael's fame stemmed primarily from Madonnas such as this, his skills extended beyond painting. And in 1514 he was appointed chief architect of the new St. Peter's Basilica in Rome by Pope Leo X. In addition, he took charge of the excavations of classical ruins taking place in Rome at the time. By the beginning of the 1520s, Raphael was a major figure in Rome, on intimate and influential terms with the Pope and his court. But, tragically, he would not be able to enjoy his fame. Raphael died on his 37th birthday, on April 6, 1520. But having produced in his short lifetime some of the most memorable images of Western art. Raphael was the second of the great triumvirate of Florentine High Renaissance geniuses to die, the great Leonardo having died the previous year at the age of 67. By contrast, Michelangelo would survive for another 44 years, his greatest painting during this period taking place once more within the Sistine Chapel between 1536 and 1541, with his massive fresco for the altar wall. A pessimistic work illustrating the moment of separation between those destined for salvation on the left and those condemned to damnation on the right.
We must, I think, recognize that the painting of the end wall in the Sistine Chapel was painted after the kind of the sack of Rome. Terrible things had happened in Rome. And so Michelangelo's portrayal of Christ, heroic figure, is actually also a kind of a vengeful Christ. This is the last judgment. Figures are either going to heaven or being kind of sent to hell. And is a rather a daunting, unforgiving Christ, a daunting, rather kind of horrific kind of image.
The gloom and pessimism within it is striking within the figures that surround the bottom layers. You have figures being dragged down to hell, being flayed. Also, the figures are not heroic figures. There's a flabbiness to them, especially if you compare them to the ceiling, where there's more of a structured norm. And there's possibly a self-portrait of the flayed skin of Michelangelo. You can almost say he wasn't in a very good mood. It's very doom and gloom based.
By the time of Michelangelo's death in 1564, the Reformation of the Church, heralded by the German Martin Luther in 1517, would eventually end the universal authority of the Pope in ecclesiastical matters in Europe and lead to the establishment of the Protestant churches, a development that would have met with the approval of the greatest artist of the Renaissance period to hail from north of the Alps, Albrecht Dürer. Born in Nuremberg in 1471, Dürer began learning the traditions of the northern artists, which had developed almost entirely independently of Italian influence. 15th century northern artists such as Jan van Eyck and Roger van der Weyden created works whose beauty derived from strict observation of reality, applied in great detail, usually with the new oil paint, pioneered by van Eyck. This tradition can be seen in Dürer's simple but wonderfully natural picture of a hare, which can be seen in Vienna. But Dürer was also aware of the great developments going on in Italian art and sought to incorporate the scientific approach of the Italians into his own work back in Nuremberg. His woodcut of Adam and Eve perhaps best illustrates these efforts, although his self-portrait of 1498, more wholly in the northern tradition, is a far more significant work. Dürer is often regarded as the great artist of the Reformation, and his ardent support for Martin Luther is well documented. Many thinkers of the Reformation considered all art to be forbidden graven images, especially sculptures, and as their ideas took hold in regions such as Switzerland, the artist's traditional role in painting religious images for churches was no longer available. If the artist was not to starve, he would have to find a new source of income. One new source of income was portrait painting, and in Northern Europe, the greatest of his age was Hans Holbein. A German, like Dürer, though over 25 years younger, Holbein worked as an illustrator in his early career and also traveled to Italy, where he encountered the work of Leonardo, amongst others. Basing himself in Basel, Switzerland, Holbein's finest early work is the altarpiece, Virgin and Child, with the family of Burgermeister Meyer, a richly colored yet simple work which firmly established his reputation. He moved to England, where he eventually became the court painter to the court of King Henry VIII, and set about producing a series of portraits that captured the spirit of that tumultuous era in English history. The National Gallery in London is home to one of his best-known portraits, The Ambassadors.
This is a remarkable double portrait showing so-called two ambassadors with accoutrements or objects on the table which demonstrate their kind of learning, contemporary science, and awareness of geography, latest discoveries. There is actually almost a kind of hidden iconography in it. We can locate these individuals with reference to, for example, a place where they came from. And Holbein has filled the picture with kind of hidden symbolism. But perhaps the most enigmatic symbol, of course, is the rather distorted image that rests in front of the whole scene, a human skull.
The skull is almost like a elongated perspective, which is placed in there to indicate mortality, and the ambassadors themselves possibly indicating the treachery of diplomacy within that era.
If Holbein was the undoubted master portraitist of his age in Northern Europe, amongst the Italian artists of the time, that honor goes to a man born around 1480, christened Tiziano Vecellio, but universally known as Titian, one of the true greats of 16th century art, and a man who hailed not from Florence like so many other greats, but from Venice. In Venice's Santa Maria dei Freri, one can view the project that brought Titian to wider attention, his monumental Assumption of the Virgin from 1518.
The Assumption of the Virgin by Titian is revolutionary because he sets within this very tall rectangle a circle which surmounts the entire rectangle. He cuts it in two predominantly, with the apostles at the bottom occupying almost a rectangle or a square area of the image. The friars who commissioned the piece thought it was too theatrical. It was the first time, as it were, one saw this use of gesture being indicated. The hands of the apostles reaching up towards the Virgin create lines which extend the eye upwards. The Virgin herself, the direction of her eyes, indicates where to look next. So it's basically the unity of the circle, the divine circle being surmounted on top of this rectangular format with the internal movements between the two areas. Also, the apostles, they're seen against a brilliant light, and as a result, they're not clearly divisible. It's almost like a mob, trying to pull back the Virgin.
It is possible that Titian's status as the leading Venetian artist of the Renaissance would not have been achieved if one of his contemporaries had not died so tragically young. If we compare one of Titian's best-known works, the reclining nude Venus of Urbino, with a work entitled Sleeping Venus, painted 30 years earlier, the similarity of pose is obvious. This earlier work was produced by a man of whose life little is known, Giorgio Bavarelli, known as Giorgione. Born around the same time as Titian, Giorgione lived only until his early 30s, and only a handful of works can authoritatively be attributed to him. But what little he did produce was remarkable. Sleeping Venus is the first painting of modern times to take as its subject matter the female nude set against a landscape. And Titian borrowed the pose wholesale for his own classic nude 3 decades later. His Concert Champêtre in the Louvre is another deeply sensual work, set against an intriguing, dreamy landscape. That Giorgione was able to achieve so much in such a short time perhaps gives us as good an indication as any of the vitality of the times he lived in. It was a remarkable age, with so many aspects of art that we now take for granted appearing in a remarkably brief period of history. In Florence, Venice, and Rome, and to a lesser degree elsewhere in Europe, the early 15th century was a thrilling time to be an artist. Inspired by the ancients, the greats of the Renaissance launched the art world into the modern age, and it has never since looked back.